So, a few days ago, a picture began to circulate in South Korean social media. It was a picture of a group of South Korean boys who had just graduated. They commemorated their high school graduation with a picture. It was a parody of the dancing pallbearers who have become a meme. The boys dressed up in their suits, they wore sunglasses and hats, and they even posed with a fake coffin. Unfortunately, however, they also painted their faces brown. It was blackface. When I saw this picture, I decided not to tweet or write about it. And the reason why I chose not to do it was because these were high school kids, they're minors. And my reasoning was this: these aren't your white American kids who learned in school about the evils of slavery and racism and the Jim Crow laws. These were Korean high school kids who lived their whole lives in Korea who might not actually have known that what they were doing was offensive. And social media, as anyone who's ever been on social media knows, can be a really vicious place. And I wasn't sure if dragging them through the muck of social media was the best way to let them know that what they did was a bad thing. But of course, it was only a matter of time before someone talked about it, and that someone was Sam Okyere. Now, Sam Okyere might not be a household name for those who are not familiar with Korea or Korean media, but Sam Okyere is actually an immigrant from Ghana. He is an entertainer and a media personality who has been appearing on Korean television shows for quite a few years now. Okyere, being a black man, was naturally more upset about this than I was. And so he took to his Instagram page and he shared the picture, and he also wrote a comment on that picture that he shared. The comment that he wrote was written in both Korean and English, but they're not exact translations of each other. So I'm going to read you the translated version of what he wrote in Korean first. Now, this is just my translation, so if there's any mistake in it, then the fault lies with me and me alone. So this is what he wrote in Korean. It's unfortunate and sad to see things like this in 2020. It's not funny. From black people's point of view, the act is very unpleasant. Please stop doing that. While I understand wanting to copy someone else's culture, do people have to color their faces too? I'd like it very much if these kinds of actions no longer took place in Korea. Respecting each other's cultures is a good thing. Also, if there is an opportunity, I'd like to talk about this with you. End quote. So that's what he wrote in Korean, and this is what he wrote in English. Time and time again, why won't people get that blackface is very offensive and not funny at all? There have been so many instances, both on and off air, where people paint their faces black here in Korea and think it's funny. It's not, and I'm highly against it and highly disappointed. You put in so much effort to educate people here in Korea and make them understand that you can appreciate a culture without making a mockery of the people. This has to stop in Korea. This ignorance cannot continue. I can only speak for myself, but personally, I didn't find anything objectionable about what Okyere had said. Unfortunately, however, a lot of people on social media do not agree with me. In fact, as ridiculous as this may be, even though Okyere is a member of an ethnic minority group and he expressed his disappointment about what had happened, a lot of people on social media have painted Okyere to be the bad guy. A really frustrating thing about this whole thing is that nothing Okyere said was actually all that controversial. The only reason why what he said was controversial was not because of what he said, but rather is because he said it. So no, nothing that Okyere said was actually controversial. It was only controversial because a black man said it. Had I said it, It wouldn't have registered with anyone. And I think we should all be ashamed of that. I made the mistake of reading through the comments. Now, I'm sure that this will not come as a shock to any of you that the comments can be quite toxic. So I sifted through them and I picked out the ones that I thought was most representative of the criticisms that people had for Okyere. The first main criticism that a lot of people had was that when Okyere shared this picture of these high school boys, he didn't try to hide any of their identities. He didn't pixelate any of their faces or any of that nature. Now, it's true that the picture was shared by the people who had originally taken the photo, but that doesn't matter. As the adults, Okyere should have tried to protect the high school students' privacy. He failed in that regard. And that was the first big criticism. Now, that first argument was one that I could sympathize with. But from here on out, the rest start to become less based on good faith, if I can use that euphemism. The second main criticism that a lot of people wrote was about one of the hashtags that Sam Okyere had written. Now, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce this word, but it's either pronounced as TK-pop or Teak-pop. I've never heard of this hashtag before, and I only heard it just yesterday. Now, apparently, Teak-pop, as how I'm going to pronounce it for the rest of this video, please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, is a hashtag that people use online when they gossip about unsubstantiated rumors about K-pop celebrities. The reason why people were criticizing Okyere's use of this hashtag was that people posited that Okyere, being a celebrity with many followers, was trying to use this particular hashtag to try to gain as much international attention as he could. Now, this was apparently a problem because some people interpreted this as Okyere's way of trying to galvanize a large number of people from all over the world to criticize a group of high school boys. And many people have said that this was a type of bullying. The third criticism was about what he had written in English, a specific part. I'll read that part out. It's the part that says, "You put so much effort to educate people here in Korea and make them understand that you can appreciate a culture without making a mockery of the people. This has to stop in Korea. This ignorance cannot continue." A number of people took issue with this statement that Okyere had written because they believed that Okyere was denigrating South Korea's education system. They were saying that he was implying that South Korea's education system is subpar and producing ignorant students. And then there was a fourth criticism. Now, either offended on behalf of the students or offended on behalf of themselves, some people decided to do some detective work on their own. And what those people did was that they dug through the internet to find dirt on Sam Okyere. And they found it. As it turned out, a few years ago, Okyere was on a TV show. And on this TV show, he did the slant eyes pose. And I have not seen the show. I did not see the episode. I do not know what the context was behind what Okyere did. But what a lot of people wrote about it, as they shared that picture of Okyere doing the slant eyes, was that because Okyere had done slant eyes before, that means that he can't possibly complain about people who do blackface in Korea. Now, I was a little curious as to who or what kind of people might have been writing this comment, and apparently I wasn't the only one. I came across this blog called Netizen Buzz, and this blog did the mind-numbingly painful work of translating all of the comments that people had written from Korean to English. And they also did the even more painstaking task of finding out the demographics. As it turns out, about 64% of the people who had written those comments were men, and 34% of the people who had written those comments were people in their 40s, and 33% of people were people in their 30s. People who are in or close to my generation. So that was a great feeling. And here's the problem that I had with the majority of these comments. Forget the fact that some of them used dubious arguments to attack a black man. The thing that offended me quite the most was that the vast majority of them came down to one theme, and that theme was go back to your country. Love it or leave it. If I had ever gotten $1 for every time I had heard go back to your country, I'm sure that I'd be a much richer man than I am today. After receiving all that criticism that he got, Okyere decided to delete his original post and he uploaded an apology. So that was upsetting. When he uploaded his apology, it was written only in Korean this time. So I'll translate that too. He said, and I quote, "I apologize for the negativity that was caused by the picture and statement that I published. I had no intention of disparaging the students. I merely wished to express my opinion, but I crossed the line, and I apologize for uploading a picture of the students without the students' permission. I respect the students' privacy. It was wrong of me to have done that. As for the parts I wrote in English, I did not mean to imply that Korean education has failed. I regret that my intention was misinterpreted. Although I had no intention to even mention Korea's education system, my expression left plenty of room for misinterpretation. I did not know that T-pop was used to speak ill of K-pop. Had I known, I would not have used that hashtag. I was naive." End quote. Now, personally, I thought that it was bad enough that a black man had to apologize for being angry about blackface. It would have been bad enough had things stopped there. It did not. After Okyere published his apology, more criticisms emerged. The first criticism that people came up with after his apology was that this time he wrote it only in Korean. Now, I don't know Okyere. I've never met him. I've never spoken to him. But I imagine that the reason that he wrote only in Korean was because this time he wanted to make sure that no one would misinterpret what he meant. But that's not the takeaway that people got. What a lot of people said when they saw that he only wrote in Korean was that he was being a coward. Now, the reason why they said that was because, as I said earlier, they posited that when he wrote his original post in English, he was trying to attract international attention to basically pile on these high school students. But this time, now that Okyere has been exposed to have been in the wrong, Okyere wrote only in Korean so that he would be able to minimize international attention. The second criticism that people had was that Okyere admitted to not having known what T-pop meant. And so the criticism was, if Okyere did not know what T-pop meant and was seeking for people's understanding for his misuse of the hashtag, then why couldn't Okyere understand that those high school boys might not have understood that their action was racist? Why did he feel like that the first thing that he needed to do was to attack these boys instead of very calmly trying to educate people as to why blackface was bad? Needless to say, this is all very frustrating. Now, I'm going to talk about myself for a brief moment here. I've experienced racism my entire life. I grew up in Brunei, and while I was growing up in Brunei, I had experienced fully grown Malay adult males call my family and me Cina babi, which is Malay for Chinese pigs. No, I'm not Chinese, but I don't think that really matters to a racist. Later, when I moved to America, I experienced a much broader form of racism. Racism that ranged from people assuming that I was very good at math, to people who yelled chink at my face. Again, it didn't matter that I was Korean. In Korea, I don't experience the kind of racism that I experienced when I was younger. Because, I'm Korean. But I experienced something else. Because I grew up and spent most of my life in other countries, I'm not treated like a Korean. I'm treated as a kyopo, which means an overseas Korean, a perpetual outsider. So, because I've experienced so much racism throughout my entire life, that whenever I see it, whenever I experience it, whether or not it is aimed at me or someone else, I feel this knot in the pit of my stomach. And I feel it again right now, for all kinds of reasons. As I watched this whole thing unfold, I remembered watching a video that Okyere was in a few years ago. It was on a Korean TV show, and Okyere was explaining about this episode of racism that he experienced while he was here in Korea. He explained the whole thing in Korean, and I'm not sure if there's any English subtitles. So I'll link the video down below, but I'll give you the gist of what he said right now. In that video, Okyere explained that one day he had boarded the subway train, and when he got on board, he saw that there was an empty seat. So he approached that area so that he could sit down. But before he could, an older woman who was seated next to the empty seat suddenly sprawled out her arms and legs and said, "You can't sit here." She started yelling at him, and she said, "Go back to your country." Naturally, Okyere felt hurt. But Okyere said that the thing that hurt him the most was not that woman, but rather all the other Koreans who were on that subway car who did not say a single thing. They either ignored what was going on, or they just looked on, but none of them came to stand in support of Okyere. I can only imagine just how alone that he must have felt that day. God knows that I have a very high opinion of myself, but objectively speaking, I'm not anyone special. I've never met Okyere. I don't even know the man. I only know him from TV. And the truth is, I'm a Korean who tweets and does YouTube videos in English. The possibility or the prospect of my becoming a huge social media personality is slim to none. But that being said, even though I'm not anyone special, this is my way of standing up for Okyere right now. Now, I don't know why Okyere did the slant eyes on that TV show. Maybe he thought it was being funny. I don't know the context of it. But whatever the reason, I hope that he regrets what he did. Similarly, I don't know those high school boys. I don't know why they chose to do blackface. I don't know the context of it. And I hope that they regret what they did. But whatever the context may have been, I think that one thing that we should all try to learn from this is that we should all try to be a bit more humble, starting with myself, that we should all learn to say, "I'm sorry," when something that we say or do might cause offense to someone else. Especially when that thing that we say or do is in regards to other people's race and ethnicity, which is something personal and completely out of our own control. None of us are born into the race that we chose. None of us got that choice. But the fact that that is something that people choose to mock, whether intentionally or not, that has to stop. But whatever the intention may have been, whatever the correct interpretation of his words ought to have been, as a Korean man who lives in Korea, I believe that it is my responsibility to say here that I stand with Sam Okyere. And I think that we should all try to be better. I apologize for uploading such a heavy-laden video on a Monday. I hope that all of you have prosperous and productive weeks, and I hope that all of you stay safe. My name is John Lay, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.